Hi, this is a video on the XPath notebooks for Visual Studio Code extension. So here I'll just describe the basics of using XPath notebooks. So this will serve as a good introduction to them. So the first part, let's just go through installing the extension. So I just go to the extensions part on the sidebar and type in XPath notebook here, and we can see this Delta XML extension for Visual Studio Code. And if we click the install button, it will install this, and it's also got a dependency on another Delta XML extension for providing language services, and it will install that also. So it appears that that is now complete. Let's just, if I have a look now, so yes, we can see that those two extensions are installed. There's no install button for them. So if we just have a quick look at the README for this extension, then if we look, scroll down to step 1, setting up the XPath processor. So this requires Node.js to be installed. So if you haven't got Node.js installed, you can just click on this link and it will take you to the download site for your specific platform. So now that we've got the notebook extension installed, perhaps we should start just by having a quick look at a notebook that's already been created. So what I'll do is I'll bring one across. So I'll just drag one from another Visual Studio Code instance. And this is shown here. So this is effectively a set of cells that are either markdown cells or code cells. So there's actually there's a lot more markdown than code, but generally it would be the other way around, I imagine. But so when we've got this set up, the other thing that we can do is have a look at the outline. Let's remove that and just bring, so we get an outline of our notebook here. So this outline is actually controlled by the headings that you see in the actual markdown cells. So each one of these cells, if I click on this, it will show that this is the current selected cell, and we see a single blue line indicating that this is the selected cell, but it also indicates that it's in command mode rather than edit mode. So to go to edit mode, we double click on it, and then a blue outline appears around it in edit mode. And of course, because this is markdown, we actually see the raw markdown for this. So in command mode, to get back to there, I can just escape, and in command mode, shortcut keys can be used, or commands can be used to actually manage that particular cell. So for example, I could move that cell down or up just by using shift and then the up and down arrow keys. Okay, so this is general markdown. So each one of these entries in the outline corresponds to a different cell generally. And if I click on follow cursor, it should be that when I select different parts of the notebook, it will jump to that particular part. And you can see that there's just a grey line alongside the current cell. So that's a useful way of being able to navigate the notebook. So let's get into the code cells. So this is a code cell, and so it's syntax highlighted XPath. We can see that it's the XPath language by this. This is the status bar at the bottom here, and it's got a status bar item where if I click on that, it gives me a choice of other languages, so I can switch it to Markdown and ignore the JavaScript because currently that's not supported in this extension. So we could switch this to being a Markdown cell if we chose, but we'll escape from that. So let's execute that cell. So it's press Control Enter to execute. And so that is the result of that cell executing. And so by default, the result is just in JSON format, and it's using the built-in JSON renderer. So we can have a look here. If we click on this button, which lets us choose the output type, we can switch between JSON output or HTML output. Now, if it's JSON output, you can use third-party extensions to give you a richer kind of output. So that is extremely useful, especially when you've got larger data sets and when you want interactive tables or plots of data. So we'll escape that for the time being. So that's just a very basic XPath expression being executed, giving us a string as a result. And we can go on to another cell and do something similar. So if I run that, then this is actually giving us a sequence of arrays, and the actual JSON notation that we use, we actually represent a sequence in the same way as an array, just with these square brackets. Excuse me. So and then we see that each member of that array, we've got a string type, and then we've also got a numeric type. So we can also represent maps. So this is going to be a sequence of maps here, and so if I click on that, we've got effectively, it's showing in JSON, it's showing an array of maps. And so just to help demonstrate what happens when we get to a HTML view of this, we see an HTML table, and you get that as the alternative view. And so that's, once you've actually got your XPath expressions the way you want them, this is probably how you'd want to see the data. So right, so now we've had a quick look at a pre-built notebook. It's probably a good idea to have a look at start from scratch. So I'll just quit that notebook, and we don't need that README at the moment. So it's just a question of creating a new file with an XBook extension. So if I go to new file here, new file, so the first thing is it's telling me there's no folder open. So actually, before I do anything there, I have to actually open a folder. So it really helps if you've got a folder for managing your notebooks and also the data files associated with them. So let's go to this empty folder here. And so now if I create a new file, it will be created in this folder, and let's call this demo.xbook. So it's this extension that causes the notebook view to be shown for this file. So it's recognized by the extension as a notebook. So this is our initial view. So we have a toolbar at the top that allows us to install or insert extra cells, or run all the cells, or clear the outputs from all the code cells. And then we also have more options available to us from this drop down. So let's start with a code cell then, and let's look at perhaps an expression that similar to the one that we've just been looking at actually, but just to show how this works. So I could press Control Enter to execute that cell, but if I press Shift Enter, it will execute that cell and create a new cell of the same type. So let's press Shift Enter. There we go. And so now that we've done that, you can see that we've just got that single JSON item, which is a string. So we can go a bit further than that now and perhaps talk about the evaluation context. So because normally with XPath you've got a context file which is probably going to be XML, but it can also be JSON now with XPath 3.1 that has very good JSON handling features. But let's start off with XML. So we need to introduce an XML file into this context. So I'm just going to drag one from another Visual Studio Code index folder rather. So if I drag this XML file in, so this will be our data source. So let's put that on the right hand side, and we can just give ourselves a bit more space. So so the way the notebook works is the context item is the most recently opened editor that is not a notebook editor. So we've already set the context item to be this file that we've just dragged in. So let's just experiment with this. So let's just have a look at the one of these country elements, perhaps specifically say something like let's use a starts with and then say it's going to be the name attribute starts with, and I'm actually right, okay, starts with name. That's going to give me a single node. So you can see there that I was getting kind of problem reporting if I was misspelling functions. So that's a feature of this extension also. And you will also get auto completion for functions and other types as well. So now this XPath expression is actually returning a node, and so this is expressed also as a JSON string, but the extension adds special syntax highlighting so you can recognize it as a node. And so attributes are actually colored slightly differently. So if we were to return an attribute, then you can see that how it's shown there. So if we want to select that attribute, then if you hover over it, you'll see that it's got the go to XPath command there. So if I hold down the command and select that, you can see that in our data file it's selected that attribute in the editor. So that's effectively how it works with the context item. The other thing is that's critical is the namespace. So the default namespace for this XML file is what we see here, com.countries.delta.xml. So effectively here we've been using the default XPath default namespace set to that, and because the extension picks up all the namespace declarations from the root element. So if we actually add another cell, so if I just click on the plus code button here to put in a new cell, and let's look for something in another namespace. So there's a new com.new namespace which has got a prefix just named new. So if I do that, then you'll see that I can now execute that, and it returns that node, which I can just so it shows how the namespace context is taken from the root element of the context item. So other parts that are in the in the evaluation context are the URIs for So let's have a look at URIs first of all. So they're useful for resolving other file resources. So let's create another code cell, and let's check out. We'll tell you what. We've got this file in here that is in the same relative location as the notebook itself. So let's use that instead. So if I use the doc function and now type in gdb by country.xml and execute that, it shows that we've got a document node which is just represented by that /. So if I actually wanted the first element of that, you can see it there. So that is being resolved using the static base URI. So that is the equivalent as if I had typed static base URI as the second argument of the doc function. So if I evaluate that, it's giving me an error here because the doc function, oh sorry, it can only ever take one argument here. What I need to do here is actually use a resolve URI function. And need to close that off. And now, so it's just proving that static base URI is the correct one and is what is used by default anyway within the doc function. So the other way, let's just remove that and just run the static run that function on its own. And so here, static base URI, the type that is returned is actually a URI type in XPath, but that's converted to a string just so it can be represented in JSON form, as you can see here. So the other thing as part of the evaluation context is the base URI. So that is the URI of the actual context item. So this is shown here. So if you want to resolve URIs relative to your context item, that's how you can do that using the resolve URI function in combination with that. Okay, so to continue with talking about the evaluation context, then we have the concept of variables. So we can have variables can be used throughout your notebook. So each time you evaluate a cell, then the result of that, the most recently evaluated cell, is available as a special variable which has got an underscore name. So, and there's auto-completion for that. So if I execute that, it will give me that the most recent result, which actually was the previous cell. But just to show that it will always be the most recently evaluated cell, let's evaluate this again. So now we see that this is the most recent cell. And just to point out that the number here indicates the order of execution. So this is the 12th cell that has been executed, and so it's the last one, and we know that the 11th, so that was the penultimate cell that was executed. So that is quite useful. So now we know that if we execute this cell again, it will actually use the result of this cell because that was the most recently evaluated. So just to prove that, we get that result there. So that can be very useful, but it's critical to know the order in which those cells have been executed. But something that is rather more robust is if you actually want to assign a XPath result to a specifically named variable, then the notebook supports the concept of XPath prologue. So here you just put in variable equals and we can say something like, we'll call this CNAME, and we use this special percentage character because it's not a valid XPath operator, so that's used to separate the prologue from the rest of the expression. So if we evaluate this now, then that variable CNAME has been added to the evaluation context, so we can now use that in other expressions. So if I just type $ here, you see that's available in the autocomplete. So let's do CNAME and let's convert that to a string, and so we get China in the result. So that is how we can use prologues for assigning variables. So let's look at some more complex ways that we're showing evaluation results. So this is where the real power of notebooks and XPath notebooks comes in. So let's think of a more complex bit of code here. So perhaps, or what I might do actually is let's just think about this for a moment and create a let's just create a sequence of strings. So and I evaluate that. So that gives me an array. Sorry, it gives me a sequence, but it's represented as an array in JSON. If I actually wanted to produce an array in XPath, I would, or one method is to use square brackets and Control Enter again to run that, and you see that it's represented in JSON the same way. So that's just one thing to be aware of, that sequences and arrays are represented in the same way. But for maps, XPath maps are rather different. So if we use a map constructor here, so let's do let's get the syntax right. Country, and we'll just put and say GDP dollars. Now let's just have a number here. It's going to be a lot anyway. So and now execute that, and so the result is shown as a JSON object with properties and values corresponding to the map's keys and values. And so let's just create a sequence of maps. And let's put something in here that's different. And execute that. So now we have a sequence of maps shown in JSON like that. But once we've got a rather larger set of data, it's much more convenient to switch to the alternate view, the HTML table view. So I'll do that now, and we can see that there. So let's bring these things together then, and hopefully I've got an example that I can bring up to show a slightly more complex XPath expression. So I'm not going to type this in, I'm just going to paste this in. So if I execute that, we get, so this is effectively a slightly larger data set that we get as a result. So this is the result of evaluating this, which is effectively creating a sequence of map entries for each country, and then those map entries are being merged into a single map. So then we're able to get a single map for each country, and the sequence is shown in JSON as an array. So now if we want to actually show that as HTML, we can just switch to using the HTML output type, and we see a nice table. So this is where the real power of XPath notebooks can be used. So other things to talk about. So at the top here we have the XPath notebook. So this actually shows the kernel that is being used, and the fact that because it's an XBook file, we're using the extension's own kernel. Now, you may, for other types of notebook, you may have the option of selecting other kernels, but this only has supports one kernel type. The plan is for this extension to also use the well-established and very popular Jupyter Labs notebook type, but that's still in early stages of development in Visual Studio Code. So there are some things that have still to be resolved, but that file format for Jupyter notebooks is actually going to be built into Visual Studio Code in July's release, which is actually coming out in early August. So yes, that if the intention is to effectively support Jupyter notebooks format as well, but for the time being we're sticking with this because we've got more control over the support for this. Something else to point out, so we've got this in the status bar at the bottom of each cell. It will tell you what the context item file name was, and it will also give you the number of items in the result, just as a convenience. Now, in a future version of this extension, the idea is that you would click on this context item indicator, and that would allow you to choose another context item, and then that cell would be executed again. Currently we're just waiting for a fuller implementation of the Notebook API to allow us to do that. What else can we cover here? I think we've probably covered the basics, so I don't want to make this video too long. Perhaps if we just quickly go back to the introduction notebook, and we can see if there's anything else that's worth bringing up here. So we spent quite some time talking about the evaluation context, and we talked about the static base URI and the base URI. Yes, one thing that we didn't mention was how these some URIs or some prefixes are preloaded with namespace URI bindings, and you can actually, we exploited that in these map entry and map merge function calls here. So those prefixes are recognized. And the introduction talks about the different types of cell. We've got markdown cells and code cells. We've talked about the code cell status bar. The output cell, it's got the different types, and there is actually a way of controlling this button here that appears that allows you to switch. So that is actually a consolidated button, I believe. Well, let's have a look. So if we go back here and we click on Customize Notebook Layout, you'll see here, oh right, so this is a non-consolidated output button that we were looking at. Controls whether output action should be rendered in the output toolbar. So at the moment it doesn't show output actions, and that's this extension doesn't offer any additional output actions. So there's no need for that. So so that makes, if that setting is on, then you will see 3 dots there, but that just means that you would have to click 2 times instead of once to get to this drop down. So that's all. It's just a slight adjustment there. What else? We talked about the output types. This talks about how the different output types are rendered. Well, one thing we haven't talked about, so we'll just quickly cover it, is the empty sequence. So if I create a try and query the output and look for something like book. So we know the root element is not called book, so we should get an empty sequence as the result. And so that's represented as an empty array here. And there is no number of items that is shown for that. So that's the empty sequence. We've talked about representing XML nodes and how you can navigate to them using command click. We've seen how we've been able to assign variables. We've used the doc function and shown how that uses the static base URI by default. And there was just a note here on how we represent primitive types. So if, for example, there's a QName type, that will just be represented as a string in JSON currently, but there are plans to provide a richer output for that, but still within the confines of JSON, but perhaps using some special syntax highlighting for those types. So that is effectively the introduction. So if you want to explore more, please install the extension and try it out for yourselves. There are samples that can be found, and there is a link to those samples actually in the README file, which we can see if we switch back to the XPath extensions README. Right at the bottom, there's oh, we're clicking on the wrong extension there. That's the original language support extension that this extension uses. But if we click on the XPath notebook extension and we go down to the bottom here, you'll see that there's a link to samples in the GitHub repository there. So in fact, that's just what we've been looking at now, that introduction notebook, this one here. So the other thing perhaps to note is that for details on the XPath editor and how you can use as you type formatting and or format on save, those kinds of features, details on those are actually in the documentation for the other extension, but you can find that if we click on that link there. It takes us to the documentation for all of that, and it explains different details about formatting. You've got code folding and how IntelliSense works, and especially useful for XPath variables actually, which we tend to use quite a lot of in XPath notebooks. So okay, I'll conclude there, but yes, I will hope to produce further videos that look at the more involved features of this extension.